The marble floor of the ER waiting room was cold through my torn stockings, and my husband hadn't even looked at me once since we walked in. My collarbone was screaming, my left wrist was swollen to twice its size, and the nurse kept asking me if someone had done this to me on purpose. And I kept saying no, I fell down the stairs, because that's what he'd told me to say in the car, his voice flat as a closed door. 3 feet away, his mistress sat in a chair, with her ankle propped up on a rolled towel, sniffling delicately into a tissue that the receptionist had handed her like she was the one who'd been hurt. My husband, Theodore Lang, though everyone who mattered to him called him Teddy except me, I just called him my husband now, even in my own head, because the word felt safer than his name, was crouched in front of her chair holding her hand like it was made of glass. "I'm so sorry, baby," he murmured. "I shouldn't have let her near you." Her, like I was a stray dog that had bitten someone. 20 minutes earlier, I'd been standing at the top of our staircase in Beacon Hill, watching Priya Mehra, his executive assistant, turn something else over the past 8 months, though I'd only just put the pieces together that morning. Come down toward me with that smile she always wore around me. The one that said she knew something I didn't. She'd reached for the banister at the exact wrong moment, lost her footing, and grabbed my arm to steady herself. Except steadying herself meant yanking me sideways into the railing, hard. And then somehow she was the one who ended up sitting 2 steps down, looking dazed, while I went tumbling the rest of the way to the bottom landing. I don't know if it was an accident. I've stopped trying to know things like that for certain. What I know is that I hit the floor first, and Theodore came running from his study not because he heard me cry out, but because he heard her. "Jesus, Maddie, what did you do?" he said, not to me, to her, gathering her up before he so much as glanced down at where I was lying with my wrist, bent at an angle wrists aren't supposed to bend. I want to tell you I said something dignified in that moment. I didn't. I just laid there on the cold hardwood and watched my husband of 9 years carry another woman to the couch like she was something precious, while I pushed myself up onto an elbow that didn't want to hold my weight, blood from a cut above my eyebrow running warm down the side of my face. That's the marriage I'd had for the last year. Quiet, polite, full of small cruelties I'd trained myself not to notice. I used to be a person who noticed everything. It was practically my job, before I stopped working. Before Theodore decided my energy was better spent managing the house and supporting his career. Now I noticed things and just filed them away somewhere I didn't look at very often. The lipstick on his collar that wasn't my shade. The new perfume on him that smelled like gardenias, when I'm allergic to gardenias and he knew it. The way his assistant started attending dinners that used to be just the 2 of us for efficiency, since she handled his calendar anyway. I'd known about Maddie for 2 months. I just hadn't let myself know it the way you have to know a thing before you do something about it. The doctor came out 40 minutes later with my x-rays. A hairline fracture in my collarbone, a sprained wrist that would need a brace for 6 weeks, and 4 stitches over my eyebrow. Nothing life-threatening, nothing that would make the kind of story people gasp about. Just the quiet, deniable kind of harm, the kind where everyone can agree it was probably an accident, where the only person who has to live inside the truth of it is you. Theodore signed my discharge papers without reading them. He drove Maddie home first. Her apartment was on the way, he said, though it added 40 minutes to our drive. And I sat in the back seat of his Mercedes with my arm in a sling, watching the 2 of them talk in low voices up front like I was a delivery they'd already paid for and didn't need to make conversation with. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he turned around and looked at me properly for the first time since the staircase. "You really should be more careful," he said. "You scared her half to death." I didn't say anything. I just got out of the car, climbed the steps to our front door, and went upstairs to the guest room, because I didn't think I could lie next to him that night, without saying something I couldn't take back. What he didn't know, what almost nobody in his world knew, was that I hadn't always been Adelaide Lang, mild-mannered wife who managed his calendar's overflow and hosted his partner's wives for lunch. Before I was Adelaide Lang, I was Adelaide Voss, and before that, I was simply the only grandchild of a woman named Cornelia Voss, who'd spent 60 years building a shipping and logistics empire out of 3 rusted barges and a refusal to ever, under any circumstances, be told what she was capable of. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother in 4 years. Not because we'd fought, exactly, but because when I told her I was marrying Theodore, she'd looked at me across her kitchen table in Newport, with an expression I hadn't understood at the time, and said, "He's marrying the name. Make sure he never finds out the name is yours, not his." I'd been 28 and in love and certain she was being paranoid, and a little cruel, the way powerful old women sometimes are about the men their granddaughters choose. I told her she didn't know him. I told her I wanted a normal life, not boardrooms and proxy fights and people flinching when they said my last name. She'd let me go quietly. That was the thing about my grandmother. She never fought you on your choices. She just waited, with the patience of someone who'd outlasted 3 husbands and at least 2 attempts by her own board to push her out. "You'll come back when you're ready," was the last thing she'd said to me, and I'll still be here. I lay awake in that guest room, with my wrist throbbing under the brace, listening to Theodore's footsteps cross the hall, pause outside my door for exactly 4 seconds. I counted, and then continue on toward his phone, which I knew he'd be checking for a text from Maddie before he even tried to sleep. And I thought about my grandmother's voice. "I'll still be here." In the morning, I packed 1 suitcase while Theodore was in the shower. I left my wedding ring on the dresser, not as a statement, just because it didn't seem like mine to keep anymore. I called a car instead of waking him to ask for a ride, and I sat in the back seat, with my sling and my stitches, and watched the house I'd spent 9 years decorating get smaller in the rearview mirror. I didn't call my grandmother from the car. I went to her, the way you go to a person, not a phone number, when you've been wrong for 4 years and you finally know it. The Voss house in Newport hadn't changed. Same ivy on the same gray stone, same 2 large door that always stuck a little in humid weather. My grandmother's longtime housekeeper, Florence, opened it before I even reached the top step, and her face did something complicated when she saw the brace on my wrist and the stitches over my eye. "Oh, honey," she said, and that was almost enough to break me right there on the porch. My grandmother was in the sunroom, 81 years old, and sitting as straight-backed as a woman half her age, reading the Wall Street Journal, with reading glasses pushed up into hair that was more silver now than the chestnut I remembered. She looked up, took in the sling, the stitches, the suitcase by my feet, and didn't say a single word about any of it. She just set down the paper, stood and opened her arms. I cried into her shoulder the way I hadn't let myself cry in years, and she just held on and let me, the way she used to when I was 9, and my parents' plane went down off the coast of Maine and she became, overnight, the only family I had left. "Tell me everything," she finally said, settling me into the chair across from her. "From the beginning, and don't leave anything out because you're embarrassed. I have heard every kind of foolish thing a man can do, and none of it has ever embarrassed me." So I told her. About Maddie, about the staircase, about the gardenia perfume and the dinners, and the slow, deliberate way I'd been edited out of my own marriage over the course of a year, until I was a piece of furniture that occasionally got driven to the emergency room. I told her how Theodore hadn't looked at my x-rays, how he'd called Maddie baby while I was bleeding on our hardwood floor. My grandmother listened without interrupting once, her jaw tightening only slightly when I described the staircase. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the gray water past her garden. "Do you know," she said finally, "what Lang Property Group has been trying to close for the last 6 weeks?" I blinked. "What does that have to do with everything, darling? Pay attention." She folded her hands. "Theodore needs a $1.1 billion bridge facility to close on the Hartwell Pier redevelopment before his exclusivity window expires Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern. Without it, he loses the deposit, he loses the site to the Korean consortium that's been circling it for months, and Lang Property Group, which is leveraged up to its eyebrows, by the way, far more than he's told his board, starts looking very wobbly to anyone who knows how to read a balance sheet. How do you? Because, Adelaide, I am the limited partner behind the fund that's been quietly underwriting that bridge facility through 3 layers of intermediary structures, none of which carry the name Voss anywhere a junior associate would think to look." She said this the way other grandmothers might mention they'd made a casserole. "I have known who your husband was negotiating with for 2 months. I simply didn't know, until this morning, that he was also putting my granddaughter in the emergency room." I sat very still. "You're his lender." "I am the reason his lender exists," she corrected. "There's a difference, and it matters enormously right now." Something in my chest, something that had been clenched tight for a year, loosened just slightly. Not relief, exactly. Recognition, like a door I'd forgotten was there, had just creaked open an inch. "What are you going to do?" I asked. She looked at me over her glasses, and for just a second I saw the woman who'd built an empire out of 3 barges and pure refusal. "What I'm not going to do," she said, "is hand $1 billion to a man who would let his wife bleed on the floor while he comforted the woman who pushed her. The only question, darling, is what you want to do about it. This is your marriage. It can be your decision." I thought about the 4 seconds Theodore had paused outside my door before walking past it. I thought about Maddie's ankle propped up on a towel while my collarbone sat fractured and unattended for 40 minutes. I thought about 9 years of making myself smaller so a man could feel bigger. I want him to understand exactly what he threw away, I said. Not just me. All of it. I want him to find out on Friday, in front of his board, exactly whose money he's been begging for. My grandmother smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from her in 4 years, and it was not a kind smile, not exactly. But it was the smile of a woman who had been waiting a long time to be useful to someone she loved. Now, she said, reaching for her phone, that's the granddaughter I raised. The next 5 days moved differently than any days I'd lived in the last 9 years. My grandmother didn't make a single dramatic phone call, didn't fire off any furious texts, didn't do anything that would have shown up on Theodore's radar at all. Instead, she made quiet calls to people whose names I half recognized from galas I'd attended as Mrs. Theodore Lang, men and women who ran pension funds, family offices, insurance reserves, the kind of patient institutional money that doesn't chase headlines but decides, behind closed doors, whether a real estate empire gets to keep breathing. Theodore thinks he's been negotiating with a syndicate of cautious bankers, my grandmother explained to me on Wednesday, over tea in the sunroom. Her tablet opened to a cap table I only half understood. What he's actually been negotiating with, this entire time, is me. Every counterparty who's been slow walking his term sheet. Every lawyer who's suddenly found a new objection to his collateral package. Every single one of them takes direction, eventually, from the same place. They just didn't know I'd be paying close personal attention this week. I spent those 5 days the way I imagine a person spends days after a long fever finally breaks. Sleeping more than I had in months. Going on slow walks along the seawall with my arm still in its brace. Eating Florence's cooking, letting my grandmother's lawyer, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Gideon Park, draw up divorce papers that I read 3 times before I signed them, just to make sure I understood every line. There was no anger in the signing. By then the anger had mostly burned down into something colder and steadier, something I could actually use. Theodore called 11 times in those 5 days. I didn't answer once. He texted twice, the first time asking where I was, the second time 2 days later, asking if I'd seen his cufflinks, as if I'd left for a weekend trip and not for good. I screenshotted that text and sent it to my grandmother with no caption. She sent back a single laughing emoji, which from a woman who didn't believe in unnecessary punctuation, let alone emojis, told me everything about how she felt regarding my husband. On Thursday evening, Gideon walked me through exactly how Friday would unfold. In a tone so calm it was almost soothing, like he was describing a piece of choreography he'd rehearsed 100 times before. Even though I knew this particular sequence had never happened quite this way for anyone. Lang Property Group's board meets at 9, he said. Theodore has scheduled a call at 10 with the lead arranger on the bridge facility to finalize terms before signing closes at 5. What he doesn't know is that the lead arranger reports, 3 layers up, to your grandmother's fund. At 9:45, 15 minutes before his call, our firm will file the finalized divorce papers, which include a properly executed prenup clause. The one he insisted on, incidentally, 4 years into the marriage, the one his lawyers were so proud of. He wrote a prenup that protects me? I asked, confused. I'd genuinely forgotten the details. Theodore had handled the actual signing with so much fanfare about protecting the family business that I'd assumed it protected only him. Gideon almost smiled. He wrote a prenup that protects Lang Property Group's separately held assets from claims by a spouse in the event of divorce. Which is what he wanted, and which is exactly what he's getting. What he failed to account for is that none of the Voss family holdings were ever commingled with marital assets. Not the trust, not your shares, nothing. Which means the prenup he was so proud of does absolutely nothing to prevent your grandmother's fund from doing whatever it wants with money it was never obligated to lend him in the first place. So you're saying his own prenup is irrelevant to what happens tomorrow? Yes. It protects his company from you. It does nothing to protect his company from her. Gideon nodded toward my grandmother, who was sitting by the window, looking out at the water with the calm of someone watching weather she'd already forecast. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't the old kind of sleeplessness, the kind built from dread. This was something closer to the night before a flight, to somewhere I'd always wanted to go. Friday morning, I sat in my grandmother's study while she took a call on speakerphone with the head of her fund's credit committee. A clipped, efficient woman named Renata, who I gathered had worked with my grandmother for over a decade. Confirm the position, my grandmother said. Confirmed, Renata answered. We're the majority holder across all 3 tranches. Lang Property Group has no idea. Their term sheet still lists us under the Ardmore Capital name, good. At 9:45, the moment legal confirms the divorce filing has gone through, I want every one of our representatives on that 10 o'clock call to inform Mr. Lang that the facility is being withdrawn, effective immediately. due to what our risk committee will generously describe as newly identified character and reputational concerns regarding the borrower. I want it on record. I want it documented. And Renata, make sure his board gets the memo by end of day, not from us directly but through the usual channels. I imagine several of his independent directors will find it very educational reading. Understood. My grandmother ended the call and looked at me, her expression unreadable in the particular way that meant she was choosing her next words carefully. You don't have to be here for this part, she said. I can have Gideon call you when it's done. No, I said. I want to hear it happen. So I sat with her, in a sunroom overlooking gray Atlantic water, while 300 miles away in a glass-walled conference room in Boston, my husband's entire empire began very quietly to come apart. I found out the details later, from Gideon, who'd had someone monitoring the public filings, and later still from a mutual friend who happened to be in the building that day and couldn't resist texting me about it, even though she had no idea yet that I'd had anything to do with it. At 9:45, the divorce papers were filed and immediately served to Theodore's office, interrupting a meeting he was having with his head of acquisitions. He reportedly read the cover page, said something about how he'd deal with it after closing, and went back to his slide deck. At 10 o'clock sharp, he dialed into the call with the lead arranger, breezy and confident, ready to finalize the documentation on the largest deal of his career. According to my friend, who heard it secondhand from someone in the room, he opened with a joke about how relieved he'd be once this circus was behind him. The relationship manager on the other end, a man named Curtis On, whom Theodore had wined and dined at 3 separate steakhouses over the past 2 months, informed him, in language so corporate it could have been read off a teleprompter, that the credit committee had convened that morning and elected to withdraw the facility in its entirety, citing newly identified concerns that made the bank uncomfortable proceeding to close at this time. Theodore apparently laughed, assuming it was some kind of last-minute leverage play, a negotiating tactic before they nudged his rate up another quarter point. He asked what it would take to get the facility back on track by end of day. There was a pause on the line. Then Curtis On said something that, when I heard it secondhand, made me put down my teacup very carefully so I wouldn't drop it. Mr. Lang, I want to be direct with you. The decision came from above my level, from the fund's principal investor, personally. I was told to convey that, and I'm reading this verbatim. A man who lets his wife bleed on a hardwood floor while comforting the woman who pushed her does not deserve $1 billion of anyone's patience, let alone mine. According to my friend, the room went completely silent. Theodore reportedly asked, voice gone thin, how the bank could possibly know anything about his personal life. Curtis didn't answer that question. He didn't have to. The call ended 4 minutes later, and by noon, 2 of Theodore's other lenders, smaller relationships but nervous ones, had quietly begun asking their own questions about Lang Property Group's liquidity, the way nervous money always does the moment it smells fear on bigger money. By 2 o'clock, the Hartwell Pier deposit was gone, forfeited under the terms of his exclusivity agreement. By 3, the Korean consortium's broker had already called Theodore's counterparty to start renegotiating directly. By 4, an emergency call had been scheduled with Lang Property Group's board for Monday morning, the kind of call that, in my limited experience watching Theodore's career from the sidelines for 9 years, only ever happened when a CEO's job was the agenda item. I didn't gloat, exactly. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story, as though I sat in that sunroom feeling triumphant and vicious, savoring every text update like a meal. I didn't. Mostly I felt something quieter than triumph, something closer to finally exhaling after holding my breath for an entire year. I thought about the 40 minutes I'd sat in that ER with my collarbone unattended. I thought about the 4 seconds of silence outside my door. And I thought, good. Let him understand, even once, what it feels like to be the one left unattended while everyone scrambles to comfort someone else. He called me that night. I almost didn't answer, and then I did, because I realized I wanted him to hear my voice be steady. Adelaide, what did you do? He said, no greeting, voice cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him in 9 years of marriage. Tell me this isn't because of you. Tell me you don't have anything to do with this. I didn't do anything, Theodore, I said, and it was even true, in the narrowest technical sense. I just went to visit my grandmother. There was a long silence on the line. I could practically hear him doing the math, hear the exact moment something clicked into place behind his eyes. 4 years too late. Voss, he said quietly. Cornelia Voss is your grandmother. I told you that on our second date, I said. You said it didn't matter to you. You said you weren't marrying my family. I didn't, Adelaide. I didn't know she was. Nobody knew Ardmore Capital was. He stopped, started again. I need to talk to her. I need you to put in a word. Just get me a meeting. I can explain. I can fix this, if she would just. She told me something 4 years ago that I didn't understand at the time, I said. She said you were marrying the name and that I should make sure you never found out the name was mine. I thought she was being unfair to you. I spent 4 years trying to prove her wrong, Theodore. Do you understand what it's like to find out? The same week your collarbone gets fractured. That your grandmother was right about your husband before you'd even finished planning the wedding? Adelaide. I'm not putting in a word, I said. I'm not fixing this. You're going to walk into that board meeting Monday and explain, on your own, why the largest deal of your career evaporated in 6 hours. And you're going to do it without me standing behind you managing your calendar and smoothing things over with the partners' wives. I think you'll find that part of your life is over too. I hung up before he could answer. It was, I think, the first time in 9 years I'd ended a phone call with him instead of the other way around. The board meeting Monday did exactly what everyone in Boston's commercial real estate circles seemed to already expect by then. Theodore was placed on an indefinite leave to focus on personal matters, which is the kind of sentence boards write when they mean something much harsher, but haven't finished deciding how harsh yet. Maddie, I heard, resigned from her position as executive assistant the following week, citing new opportunities. Though the new opportunity, as far as I could tell from a single, deeply petty Google search I allowed myself one evening, appeared to be unemployment. I stayed in Newport. Not forever, but for that whole summer, in my old childhood bedroom with the window seat overlooking the garden, going on walks with my grandmother every morning before the heat set in, slowly remembering who I'd been before I spent 9 years making myself smaller. In August, my grandmother asked me, over breakfast, with no particular ceremony, whether I'd ever considered coming to work for the family company. I don't know anything about shipping, I told her. I didn't know anything about shipping either, she said. When I bought my first barge with money I borrowed from a man who thought I'd fail within a year and wanted to watch it happen up close. You learn. The only thing you actually need is the willingness to be underestimated by exactly the right people, at exactly the right moment. I think about that conversation often now, almost a year later, sitting in my own office on the 14th floor of the Voss building. My wrist long since healed. No brace, no sling. Just a thin white scar above my eyebrow that I've stopped trying to cover with makeup. I run the logistics division now, the part of the company my grandmother always said needed someone who understood patience. Understood, as she put it, that the biggest moves are rarely loud ones, that the quietest people in the room are usually holding the most weight. Theodore reached out one more time, in October, a careful, measured email asking if we could talk things through, for old time's sake. I read it twice, and then I did something I don't think the woman I was a year and a half ago would have recognized. I simply didn't answer. Not out of anger anymore. Out of something more like indifference, the kind that only comes once you've fully closed a door and noticed, with mild surprise, that you don't feel the urge to look back through the keyhole. I still think sometimes about that 40 minutes in the emergency room, my collarbone unattended, while everyone fussed over a woman who'd shoved me down a flight of stairs. I think about how small I let myself become to fit into a life that was never built to hold the size of who I actually was. And I think about my grandmother's hands, steady on the phone, dismantling $1 billion deal with nothing but patience and the truth, the same way she built 3 rusted barges into an empire 60 years ago. Quietly, completely, and without ever once raising her voice.